All right. Now, to start off, Michael, thank you so much for joining us today in what I am sure is a very busy time for you.
My pleasure. Canadian Civil Liberties Association has never been more busy. I'm happy to report, and we certainly feel like we've got a role to play during this crisis.
Absolutely. Now, to start off the conversation, I do want to open it up, I guess, with a very general question. We are still in the beginning stages of the pandemic in Canada, but is there a point you think that Canadians should be ready or expected to give up their personal rights and freedoms for the greater good of the community?
Well, it's already happened. And thus far, by and large, most people are agreeing to do it. From our perspective, there's a big difference between our political leaders saying, please do this, please do that, making recommendations on the one hand versus ordering them to do it on the other hand. So when government restricts people's liberty, then we're in unusual constitutional ground, right? So we have, and it comes back to first principles. We have a presumption of freedom in this country. We have a presumption of liberty. And the only way to restrict that liberty under our Constitution is by law. So the first thing that the government has to do if they want to restrict our freedom is they need to pass a law. Now, that may be in the legislature, or right now, what the governments are doing are relying upon legislation that has already passed, emergency management legislation in every province, emergency management legislation that applies to many cities, and the federal government and their emergency management legislation. So the law is there to allow them to do some of the things that they're doing. What triggers application of the law usually is a cabinet decision, a decision by a cabinet minister, like a health minister, or in the case of city council, by city council. And when that decision is made, they need to publish that decision. And I'll have something to say about that in a minute. And on that basis, they can then proceed and say, yep, we're restricting people's liberty. For example, today, in Toronto and in Ontario, there are restrictions on how many people can get together in public and can congregate, with lots of exceptions. So it's prescribed by law. And then I always ask, is it necessary? Is the decision being made based upon science and public health advice, or is it based on fear and politics? And so far, it would appear that the decisions are based on public health science and not on fear and politics. Okay. And then the next part and the last part, and this is the trickiest part, is it proportionate? So are we infringing upon people's rights as little as possible? And one way to think about that from my perspective is, 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, can you imagine a government coming along and saying, you're going to close all the parks, we're going to close all the facilities, we're going to close all the businesses, and you can't have 5 people congregating outside at once. People would, there'd be a revolution, right? People would go crazy. It'd be disproportionate. But today, that decision feels by and large proportionate. So we look at each decision, at each new restriction at Canadian Civil Liberties Association. We try and provide some guidance to governments, and we're watching. If a government oversteps or understeps, then we will potentially bring litigation, although we haven't brought any litigation yet. So that's the broad overview of what's happening to our rights and our freedoms under our constitutional democracy.
Of course. And you also did send a letter to Minister Lametti talking about the information that should be available to Canadians and that legal decisions should be made more aware for the public. What do you think Canadians should know right now? How can they get access to all of that information? And how do they know when their rights are perhaps being violated in an extreme manner?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And what is important to me is that, I used to be in politics, and there's different parts of any political operation or any democratic operation. So when the prime minister says something, the prime minister's office will put out their communication materials, and that's done by communication professionals. However, when it comes to restricting our liberty, I don't want to put it in the hands of spin doctors, right? I want to know what the law is. And so I wrote to and have been pushing the Minister of Justice and the Attorney General of Canada to get the legal details out. And what that looks like is it's usually called an order in council or an interim order. And the way that you used to be able to get that online was you'd find the window, then you'd do a search. It was a little obscure, but I guess you could type in COVID and see what came up. But it was lagging behind. The laws would become available, but it would take about 5 days. Now I understand why. It wasn't because of any intentional secrecy. Normally, an order in council is quite mundane, and it doesn't involve decisions about people's liberty. So it's like changing the name of a park or something like that. I mean, very, very mundane stuff. So 5 days for that to come online, that's fine. Suddenly, these decisions were urgent, but there was a lag between what the communications people were saying and what the legal decision was. So I'm happy to say that the federal government about 3 days ago put up a new site, and they are making it easier to find the latest orders on COVID. That's the good news. The bad news is I had been using the example of the provinces and saying, look, the provinces are doing a better job than you, federal government. They get these orders in council up quicker. And I guess I spoke too soon, because just when the feds figured out a way to do this in a way that makes a lot more sense, the provinces have started falling behind. So I know the Ontario orders in council are about a week late getting up. So we have to work on every province. So that's why it's important for us to get our hands on it. The public needs to be able to access it and find it. I think that the transparency around public health needs to be matched with the transparency around our laws. And, you could say, we also need transparency for education and for public works and for transportation. I agree with all that. But I think that if you're going to, in the name of public health, restrict people's liberty, we need to have those legal information up online. So we'll continue to push for that. And in the meantime, up on our website, ccla.org, people can go find the latest orders and legal instruments that have been released by the executive branch or the cabinet of each government.
Mm-hmm. And now we also have to talk a lot about the vulnerable populations, I think, because there are a lot of different demographics that are being affected by COVID-19, not just in a physical health kind of way, but sometimes mental health, sometimes, just their basic liberties being affected. So I want to start off with a certain group that is a big cause of concerns, which is women and children who may find themselves in a household where they're financially dependent, but they are suffering some kind of abuse. What kind of help, what kind of resources can they expect during this situation where, again, they're being forced to quarantine in an environment that cannot be safe?
Yeah, so the women's shelters right now are a safe haven and a public health risk all at once, right? Mm-hmm. The women's shelters and the homelessness shelters are not built for social distancing, and they tend to be full to capacity at the best of times. Now you add social distancing to that, you've got a real problem. So really what this comes down to is that when the police are enforcing these laws, they need to keep in mind that there are many exceptional circumstances, and that the group that is most likely to bear the biggest burden of these new rules, it's going to be, as you said, the most vulnerable population. So, basically, women in those circumstances and kids in those circumstances find themselves having to go to friends and neighbors and relatives' homes to quarantine there because they find themselves in danger. It is such a problem right now in the at a time in which social distancing is important, that I wish I had more solutions for them, but we don't. All I can say is that it's something that we are working on and that governments have to be working on. And I can speak to the homeless population as well if you want me to, if you want to go to that next vulnerable population.
Absolutely. And that was actually my next question, because I think these are people that do need advocates and they do need support, because right now closing down buildings, they're closing down gathering spots, places where they would find shelter, where they would find food. So what is the CCLA doing, or I guess what can you recommend for these people?
No, I'll tell you what CCLA is doing, because we've got a job to do here. And so we wrote to the mayor yesterday, having monitored this situation and spoken to public health professionals and homeless workers to determine where the city made a decision that inadvertently harmed the food security of the homeless, the ability for the homeless to shelter, and lastly, potentially put the homeless at risk of being charged with offenses because they cannot possibly comply with the new rules that have been put together. As you said, if you close down facilities, for example, like churches, then what you do is you cut off food security and food supply for individuals who every day have been going to, this church for an out of the cold feeding, that church that it acts as a soup kitchen on for breakfast on certain days, or this drop-in center that provides food during a lunch and evening. Add on top of that, the homeless shelters weren't equipped with public health nurses. Now, one of them that I know of happened to have some public health nurses who were there. They set up their own protocol. They screened people on the way in and took their temperature, for example. They limited the number of people who were going in. But the city had not yet provided either the professional services or the guidelines that would assist all homeless drop-ins to do this. And what that meant was a loss of food security. So secondly, homeless shelters are kind of by their nature warehousing people in very tight circumstances, and it's the opposite of social distancing. So basically the province, if they wanted to avoid a situation where the most vulnerable population imaginable, the homeless population, weren't themselves making the public health risk of COVID even greater for a general population, they needed to go and either apprehend existing space that wasn't being used and use it for this public health purpose, or borrow or create some space that could be used to provide shelter and a place for the homeless to be. Because, when I'm not walking the dog, I got a place to go. When I need to work, I have a place to work. When I need to eat, I can go to a grocery store. I've got money to pay for it. The homeless have got none of those things. They've got nowhere to go. If you tell them to go home, they got no home to go to. If you tell them if they've been living in a park or literally on a bench, or they've been in camping somewhere, and many of them do, they probably are running afoul of the closure of park amenities right now, say in Toronto. And in terms of food security, even if they could panhandle for cash, and there's no panhandling right now because nobody's out there in the streets, the cash isn't accepted at most of the stores. So it's a real crisis. So we were going to intervene legally and force the government to fix the things it had done that was causing harm, and force them to do the things that they weren't doing because they were infringing upon the liberty of people under our charter and infringing upon them on the basis of equality, because most of them are mentally ill and or addicted. Therefore, they're disabled, and therefore they have particular constitutional rights. But the latest is that the city actually is coming forward with a plan and is coming up with some remedies. But, as we have these interviews and when they get aired, they're almost immediately dated, right? So I should say it's just a situation that we're monitoring today. It's looking better than it was yesterday, but tomorrow I don't know if it will be satisfactory or not.
Of course. And for our viewers, perhaps there's ways that they can get involved or they can support these organizations. Do you have any information on how the people back at home could potentially lend a helping hand to these populations?
Getting food to the food banks is one. And, just you go online, make sure your local food bank is open, drop off some food there, number one. Number two, don't hoard. If you're hoarding food, then you're in fact decreasing the overall supply of food to everybody. And number three, in terms of volunteer opportunities, there are websites. Just I want to volunteer in Toronto right now during COVID. If you search that up on Google, you'll get some opportunities that arise. We're also looking for volunteers at ccla.org. In our case, the volunteers are for a wide variety of activities. One of them is just calling out to our members and letting them know the things we're doing, and reaching out to people and asking for, if they're able to provide some financial support, because our small donations, we get a lot of small donations at CCLA. They drop off during a time like this, as you can imagine, because people are concerned about their financial security. I totally understand that. People are afraid that they won't be able to pay the bills. Then I understand why they would want to hang on to their donations. On the other hand, for those who can, we're asking them to help us out, because we're a charity that's under a lot of pressure at this time, and yet we have a particular service that I think is really important today.
Of course. Now let's keep talking about the incarcerated population, because we have seen a lot of news about how Ontario and Canadian prisons might not be fully equipped to handle an outbreak. And this are people that a lot of them are over the age of 50. They might have underlying health problems. So what is the latest update, or I guess the latest information you can give us in regards to the prison system?
So you've got a situation where the general public health direction from all the experts and from all the governments is that we need to be engaging in social distancing, right? And we need to be quarantining ourselves as much as possible. Penitentiaries, prisons, and jails, which why don't we just call it prisons, all one word, they are in the business of social warehousing of people. It's the opposite of social distancing. They are also full of a population with a more compromised immune system, more likely to have people with underlying health issues, more likely to have people who are addicts and mentally ill, and obviously so a real hotbed of public health risk. So on top of that, we already have overcrowding in prisons. So having overcrowding in prisons right now is a major public health risk. And in federal penitentiaries and provincial penitentiaries, they need to adjust in the same way as the rest of the world is adjusting. So in the case of provincial prisons, most of the sentences in the prison population in each of the provinces, most of the sentences are a month or less. About 80% of the sentences are 6 months or less. And many of them are what they call intermittent sentences, where they are serving a sentence over the course of several weekends. So what they've done is, for those who have those short sentences, or they only have a little bit of time left, if that's the case, it was not that serious a crime to begin with. And the Ontario government, for example, looked at a series of nonviolent crimes and said, look, if you are serving time in a provincial jail for breaching an order, which means you were late for an appointment or you didn't go to court on time, we don't see you as a dangerous person. We need you out of the prisons and quarantining at home. And so the Ontario government released over 1,000 people from the provincial prisons. And it was an excellent moment of justice and public health. But most people in prison are actually not serving their sentence, believe it or not. Most people in prison today in Canada are awaiting their trial. They're called the remand population. So in other words, they didn't get bail, they didn't qualify for bail, and for one reason or another, a judge decided that it was better off to keep them in jail so that they would show up for their trial rather than risk them not showing up for their trial. Well, the courts are now all closed. There are no trials happening, with some exceptions. The courts are now closed except for emergency matters. So if CCLA needed to bring a challenge under our Constitution, they would open up for that. It might have to be done online, but in any event, they would open up for that. But for the hundreds of bail hearings that take place across the province every day, they're closed. So this is a problem. We have people who are being detained without the opportunity for a bail hearing. What we're saying to the provinces is, all of them, do the same thing with your remand population. In other words, those who didn't get bail. Release them, particularly if they've been charged with a nonviolent crime. Because the alternative is those who were convicted of crimes, they've been released for public health reasons. But those who have not been convicted of crimes, who haven't even had their trial yet, they're being locked up. Doesn't make any sense. So we should be releasing that population because they're so vulnerable. And that's something that we may be having to go to court to fight any day now.
Okay. And then in terms of the health resources that the prison system has, there is obviously a lot more per capita out in just a regular day-to-day society than there is in the prison systems. Is that something that would be worth fighting for as well, trying to get them the resources necessary to handle the potential spread of an outbreak, since they are just confined to small spaces?
Yeah, no, you make a really good point. And that is something that we've been asking corrections to do. We've been asking them to do what they can with those who are there and aren't going anywhere to create the circumstances in which their public health will be protected. Again, Ontario Corrections, it seems to be moving forward in that regard. They are not only spreading people out, but the Corrections Ministry in Ontario, as I understand it, is also creating other spaces for minimum security incarceration to take place, maybe on a prison property, but in the equivalent of a golf tent or a tennis bubble. It'll be supervised. You won't be free to go, but it'll be set up more like dormitories than prison cells.
Okay. And a lot of our audience is in fact a multicultural, immigration-based demographic, and there are a lot of concerns when it comes to immigration detainees. Can you talk a little bit to that point?
Yeah. So just as important as those who are in the provincial and federal prison system are the immigration detainees, which in many cases, they've done nothing wrong. They haven't had their hearing. They're being detained until they have an opportunity to have that hearing. Again, warehousing population is the wrong way to go. Social distancing and freedom is the right way to go. So and add on top of that, there's nowhere for anyone to go, right? It's not like you can escape the jurisdiction or flee the jurisdiction right now and go to another country to hide from authorities. You're not getting across a border today in Canada into the United States or anywhere else unless you have unless you fall into one of the exceptions of a particular special worker or you're a U.S. citizen and so on. So all those flight risks that used to obtain no longer obtain. Moreover, one of the things that we've discovered is that for the cost of detaining someone, it's around $200 to $300 a day. The cost, if the authorities really need to monitor people, there are electronic bracelets with GPS functionality on it, where the person can be monitored by way of the bracelet We've seen them on all the movies, and they cost about $6 a day. So $6 a day versus $300 a day. Obviously, we should go with the $6 a day option because, again, we're talking about people who are not dangerous. We aren't talking about people who have committed a crime. They're being detained because they're awaiting a hearing, and we need to find better alternatives rather than, are we part of the solution or are we part of the problem is really what it comes down to. And right now the justice system is doing an all right job at trying to be part of the solution. The correction system is really in a difficult place because everybody that it is detaining and social warehousing is part of the problem. So how do we find some solutions for them that are constitutional and are based on public health instead of on the usual fears? And this is what makes this crisis such a fascinating and extraordinary opportunity, because our public health fear may be eclipsing our unfounded, irrational fears about people who are incarcerated. We have an overblown, unfounded, and discriminatory fear about people who have been arrested or charged with crimes, that they're dangerous and bad people, and that's just not my experience. It's just not. And the truth is, the vast majority of them go into the system and come right back out, so they're a part of our community anyways. We're talking about our neighbors one way or the other. So this crisis may allow us to see firsthand that locking up individuals is in fact the last thing we should be doing. It should be a measure of last resort. It's not being used as a measure of last resort. So we are trying to use the Constitution to make sure that those people who deserve to be free are freed.
To continue on the point of immigration, I am curious, there have been a lot of solutions given to Canadians who don't qualify for EI, they qualify for the CERB, but there are, of course, and it is a controversial topic, there are people here that are working illegally that are now finding themselves with no income, with no resources. Is there any rights that they do have here in Canada right now when you can't go back to your home country, but you also can't make a living?
Yeah. So this is always a most difficult area for any government to manage. And in terms of people's rights, if you are on Canadian soil, you have a certain set of rights. It doesn't extend to labor rights. It doesn't extend to social benefits or to healthcare benefits. But people have rights nevertheless. So the basic rights to liberty, security of the person, equality, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and basic due process rights, everybody gets that, no matter what, and no matter where you're from, and no matter what circumstances put you in this country. How some labor forces are going to manage in the circumstances where they are operating off book, where they are working entirely in cash, and under circumstances where they may not have the authorization. That's right now. It's just the Canadian Civil Liberties Association is focused more on the urgent ways in which the state is infringing upon our freedom, rather than dealing with what amounts to an extraordinary economic challenge.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, now let's move on, I guess, to something that does relate back to the CCLA, and it does have to do with a lot of the measures that people are speaking about the federal government could put in place. We're talking about the Federal Emergencies Act, bringing in armed forces. Is there reason for concern if the situation keeps escalating for Canadians, and how can they be aware of when perhaps things could go too far?
So, the War Measures Act is long gone. People have heard a lot about the War Measures Act in the last few weeks. And after the War Measures Act was used back in 1970 during the October crisis, by the way, at the time, the Canadian Civil Liberties Association opposed Trudeau Sr.'s use of the War Measures Act. The Canadian Civil Liberties Association went to work with the federal government and other governments to try and create an emergency management system that respected people's rights and was not as disproportionate as the old War Measures Act. So there is literally no more War Measures Act. It's been replaced by an Emergency Management Act. The other thing that happened in Canada over the last 25 years, and especially after the SARS crisis, is public health professionals said to provinces, we don't have the legal tools to do the things that we want to do. And we weren't able to do a bunch of things during SARS that we needed to do, for example, around quarantining people. So all those laws got updated in many, many provinces and the federal government. And as a result, I know that most people were very focused on the federal government and whether or not they were going to use the Emergencies Act. In fact, the federal government started using the Quarantine Act right away. We saw all the people who were brought in from China and then also brought in from other parts of the world, brought in from a cruise ship in California. And they were housed at CFB Trenton in Ontario, where they were taken care of by the federal government with the Federal Quarantine Act. But the Federal Quarantine Act only applies to people who are coming into Canada from outside of Canada. All the other quarantining that's going on right now is provincial laws. And so in various provinces, it looks a little different. New Brunswick is patrolling their borders. Quebec was the first to go to a very small number of people who could congregate in public. Quebec's enforcement is a little different than Ontario and British Columbia's enforcement, and so on. But that's Canada. We have different approaches to things, and actually some of the things that were being done by New Brunswick, Nova Scotia a few days ago that were that were quite different than the approach in Ontario and BC. Now BC and Ontario is where they are. So that's how it's working with the different federal and provincial governments. With respect to the military, it's actually the provinces that ask for military assistance. The federal government can only ask for military assistance if they use their national power to basically take over emergency management across the country. And the Prime Minister has made it very clear they're not going to do that because each province is already doing it. Now, if you had a situation where half the country had emergency management systems in place and were doing something, and the other half was sitting back and waiting for and falling behind, then maybe the federal government might step in. But as long as the provinces continue to say, we got this, Prime Minister, they're going to continue to manage this. And as of right now, that's the way it should be. The only way that the military gets called in is if say a particular province has just run out of people and personnel, and they need military personnel to come in and assist them with the delivery, say, of healthcare, public health services, and other items, like you see the military come in, say during flood relief. The military come in and help put in place measures for safety and security to dam a flood. Similarly, you may have people, we may need to build stuff, and military may be there for that. I guess in the most extreme example, they might also be participating in crowd control, if you like. But the police already have that under wraps, and we feel very strongly that the police ought to, and if military get involved, they ought to be exercising their discretion such that they put public health first. This isn't about public order, it's about public health. And so that means advising people and exercising discretion and using these and looking at these tools of enforcement in a way that puts public health first, as opposed to putting more people in jail, which creates a problem in another part of the country.
Absolutely. Great information, great advice. And Michael, thank you so much for joining us and definitely clearing up a lot of concerns that our viewers may have had.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for having us on.